Hello, everybody. Thanks again for visiting my YouTube channel. This is the place where we discuss the Lord's Recovery Movement of Witness Lee, also known as the local church movement. Still on shepherdingwords.com. Got a couple more articles to look at, and I am going to combine two of them. One is about Max Rapoport and John Ingalls asking the question, were Max and John forced out of the Lord's Recovery? And the other one is about how to handle reports of abuse in the Lord's Recovery. Now I'm combining these together because they're both related to this issue of abuse, particularly sexual abuse. The article about John Ingalls and Max Rapoport is asking the question, were they forced out? And it's really a red herring. It's really a distraction. Nobody is really concerned whether John Ingalls and Max Rapoport were forced out of the Lord's Recovery. The fact is they were made to be so uncomfortable within the Lord's Recovery that they had no choice but leave. And being gentlemen, they did leave. Whereas members of the Lord's Recovery would do things like call people reprobates and rebels and evildoers. Anybody that doesn't do things their way gets condemned as being an evildoer, but John Ingalls and Max Rapoport were gentlemanly enough to leave the movement. They talk about several things, but really this is just a smokescreen. Max first and then John became aware of Philip Lee's molesting of local church women, even though he was in charge of the Living Stream Ministry office. He was not dealt with properly. He was covered up. This goes back to the earlier article about covering sin, not covering up. They did cover up Philip Lee. Not only did they cover him up, they made life so miserable for John Ingalls and Max Rapoport that they had no choice but to leave the Lord's Recovery. And once they did leave, the remaining leaders apologized publicly to Philip Lee and saying the actions against him were improper. It was a lot of BS, and it's along this line of their talk about how to properly handle issues in the Lord's Recovery. And this is the way they operate. Their priorities are completely screwed up. They have a person who is a serial molester, possibly a rapist, certainly a drunk, and as I've said, a whoremonger. And rather than address that issue, they address the meaningless details of how the abuse was reported. And because John Ingalls supposedly didn't go through the right channels to handle this, this is what they talk about in these articles on shepherdingwords.com about how to handle abuse. Well, all this does is gives them a chance to cover things up. And if you push a problem too hard, they're going to shut you down. They're not going to shut the problem down. So this is all baloney. This is all disingenuous. They're not interested in the truth. They're not interested in the light. They're just interested in preserving their movement at any cost. And the cost has been real lives. If you don't fall in line with them, they will destroy your life. Now, they'll do it in a way where, unless you're some kind of ruthless dealer like they are, out of decency and just seeking peace, you'll leave. But then they'll take advantage of that and they'll say, see, he left because he was not supported by the saints in the Lord's recovery. Of course they didn't support him. They know their only way to survive in the movement is to support the ultimate powers there, which were Witness Lee and now are the Blended Brothers. Who's going to side with an elder that the Blended Brothers have organized against? Nobody that wants to stay there, so of course they're going to vote for Minoru Chen over John Ingalls. And Minoru Chen was one of the ones who apologized to Philip Lee for how poorly he was handled. Poor thing. Somebody interfered with his molesting of local church sisters, and they were mean to him, messed up his little fun time, collected his whiskey bottles and threw them away, and talked about it publicly. In the meantime, all his victims are just treated like nuts and sluts. It's a shame. It's a joke. It's ridiculous. This is really the Catholic Church. Catholic Church will go on about the great holy traditions of the church and all their history of all these wonderful saints and all the wonderful things they did. In the meantime, you've got all the dirtiness and the darkness and the covered up sin, the priests impregnating nuns and then aborting the babies, discovering bones of babies buried under cathedrals because nuns had babies and they aborted them and killed them and buried them. But the Catholic churches go, well, we're still the Catholic Church. We're still the wonderful, holy Catholic Church. The Lord's Recovery does the same thing. We're still the wonderful, holy Lord's Recovery. All that is meaningless. There is no Lord's Recovery. You can't lean on being the Lord's Recovery. All we are is the church. We're the redeemed of God. We're the ones that God had mercy on. And our job is to live holy lives to Him. That's it. To try to prop up and build up and defend some institution like the recovery is not our calling, any more than our calling is to defend the institution of the Catholic Church. There is no difference. They are both human organizations which have a high potential of becoming corrupt because a vast percentage of them do. Once you see your organization going down the drain, it's time to flush that organization. You either reform it quickly or you get out. But the last thing you do is try to preserve the good name of an organization that has gone corrupt and is covering up sin, especially sexual sins. Think about Penn State University, which a decade or so ago got embroiled in a scandal about a coach who was a pedophile and who actually abused young men who he was trying to recruit into athletics programs. And he was a stalker of young men and a sexual abuser of them. The well-known and well-respected coach of Penn State, Joe Paterno, who was royalty among coaches, one of the most respected coaches in the history of college football, just had a name that seemingly could not be tarnished. Well, right at the end of his career, it was revealed that he covered up this assistant coach's abuses of young men. It was a huge scandal, and his name was shamed. His family's name was shamed. Penn State is still recovering from that. Their legacy will never be the same. Joe Paterno's legacy will never be the same. It was all because what was he trying to do? Preserve the image of the institution at the expense of victims. This is exactly what the Lord's Recovery has done, and they continue to do it. ShepherdingWords.com is nothing but a big propaganda site trying to cover this stuff up. When they talk about John Ingalls and Max Rapoport, when they don't talk about Philip Lee in the same breath, they're covering up. When they talk about so-called abuses in the Lord's Recovery and they don't mention Philip Lee, they're covering up. There's not one mention of Philip Lee in any article on ShepherdingWords.com that I have seen. This guy was a sexual abuser. He was the son of Witness Lee. They covered it up. They're continuing to cover it up. And as long as they do that, they are liars. Their plea about covering sin, that's not covering sin. It's covering their rear ends and covering up their institution. They're doing the same thing as Joe Paterno did at Penn State, and it's going to end badly for them. It's not going to end well because this stuff's eventually going to come out. In this age of the internet, you cannot cover up things like that anymore. They will come out. And BS propaganda cover-up sites like ShepherdingWords.com are just more fuel to the eventual fire that's going to explode in their face. And then to be going around saying they're the great Lord's Recovery and they're God's one true move on the earth with all of the stuff they've done? Are you kidding me? There's just no possible way. It's just the same thing as if the Catholic Church was trying to make that plea now. It just doesn't work anymore, guys. The article about abuses, yes, that's boilerplate information. It's standard operating procedure for any sane organization. Of course, they need to have these policies in place, but they're not practicing them. This is just covering their rear end stuff. And then the thing about John Ingalls and Max Rapoport was also part of the cover-up because they're not mentioned in the true subject. The true subject was not that John Ingalls and Max Rapoport were getting their own following. They were trying to deal with sin in the churches. And in those days, some people actually took seriously the idea that the churches were supposed to be autonomous, that they could stand against an apostle who was doing evil. But nowadays, they know it's a big hierarchy and the blended brothers are in control and none of the churches can do anything on their own. They can't discern apostles anymore. They just have to accept that these guys are the apostles, or they don't get to be in the Lord's Recovery. Well, this is why some of us don't want to be in the so-called Lord's Recovery. I don't know what else to say. I know sometimes I sound a little disgusted and maybe a little sarcastic, but I don't know how to address this stuff in any kind of respectful way, because there's nothing respectful about it. It's been going on too long, and they're still trying to cover it up. They're trying to rewrite history. If they're trying to correct some errors while not confessing them, that's not a good way to go about it. If you're going to correct errors, you need to make some confessions too. Don't just pretend the stuff didn't happen and say the people that brought it up were evildoers. Listeners, please don't be fooled by these guys, and please don't be intimidated by them. I realize it's disillusioning and shocking when your heroes turn out to be more fallible than the villains you used to worry about, but that's what happens, and you have to accept it, and you have to grow out of it, and you have to move on, and you realize there's a reason God said, don't be servants of men. And there's a reason the Bible says that leaders are supposed to be servants, not lords. Because when you let them be lords, this is the kind of thing that ends up happening. Every time. It's guaranteed. It's not the way the New Testament church is supposed to be led. If you want to be a New Testament leader, your assignment is serve those you lead. Period. And these guys aren't doing it. So that's it for now. Thanks again for listening. Take care.